Hello class, and welcome to the second of the three videos here for the ancient civilizations and history of women in sport, looking at the recreational habits and sporting behaviors of women from ancient cultures. Hopefully you've finished watching the one on Egyptian culture, and here now in the second video we're going to be talking about Greek culture. And we're going to be talking about what we've learned about women in the ancient Greek society based on what historians have found through the written word and artifacts that have been found, archaeological sites that have been discovered, and the pieces of evidence we can put together based on that historical information. So when we look at Greek society in the terms of how it's different from Egyptian ancient society, is that we know that women and men had clearly different roles. Women were very domesticated in Greek society. In all honesty, men often saw women as sort of troublesome, but they know they needed them to keep the home, to give birth to their children, and to take care of their children. And so it was expected for women to be very dutiful, quiet, domestic, and in all honesty, women often sought to be modest, chaste, obedient, and rather inconspicuous. However, we do see examples through mythology, stories of Greek mythology, and from some of the artifacts that have been found, that it did not mean that women didn't engage in recreational behavior or sporting activities. As a matter of fact, they definitely did engage in some festivals, oftentimes religious-based festivals, or competitions that were in honor of a Greek goddess of some type. And a lot of times they were like coming of age events that were premarital events, and so they were a lot of times held for younger women, virgin women. But indeed, we do have documentation that those types of activities happened and occurred, and we will discuss a couple of those here coming up. So we do recognize that much like Egyptian culture, ancient culture, that women did engage in the popular sort of activities were ball games. We see images of women with varying types of balls in the images. So they were clearly engaging in those types of activities: swimming, running, chariot racing, and training. We know that these are types of activities that Greek women probably did engage in regularly, but then there's also images that we know that definitely lead us to believe that there were other types of activities as well that women did engage in. Whether that was more frequent or not is hard to tell, because it is tough to generalize overall with Greek ancient cultures, because we know more about upper class society than lower class, and the city-states were so different and varied that it is hard to definitively generalize. However, from the historical facts that have been documented, we can pretty much gather what was fairly typical of the women in these cultures. So again, maybe not as much thinking about the home being the source of delight like we did in ancient culture, so the women needed to be treated well and they needed to be happy, but definitely a domestication of women was clear in terms of their role in society. I do want to talk about, speaking of Greek mythology and stories from Greek myth, I want to highlight a couple of them, a couple of Greek goddesses that I think are important because they do present an image of a strong, independent woman that definitely sort of breaks the traditional role or the typical role that we saw with that domesticated female from ancient Greek culture. The first one is Atalanta, this mythological story of the virgin huntress Atalanta, who was born to her father, and who wanted King Isis, who wanted a son. When he didn't, he left her on a mountaintop to die. However, she survived and learned to become a fierce hunter, and she took a vow of virginity to the goddess Artemis, who we're going to talk about in a little bit. But another strong female symbol. But the story about Atalanta is interesting because it gives kind of it gives sort of a little bit of a mixed message on that strong, independent woman who makes decisions for herself and wants to sort of, define her own future and destiny. Because the story of Atalanta, hopefully, as you read in your reading, was that when she did come back from the mountaintop and was reunited with her father, he wanted her to wed. She did not want to do that. As a matter of fact, she had actually killed off some suitors that were pretty aggressive in wanting to take her as, their take her as their own. And so she had been known to actually kill or severely wound men who were fairly rigorous in their attempt to, um, to gain her as their possession. So anyway, her father wanted her to wed. She did not want to do this, and so she did make a claim and said, if a male suitor wants to take me on a race and beat me by foot, that he will become the person I will wed. And the story then continues on, and Hippomenes goes to Aphrodite and says, I need to beat this woman. I need to find a way to beat her in a foot race. And so Aphrodite gives Hippomenes 3 golden apples, and the golden apples are used to distract Atalanta in their race. And so, sure enough, he uses those when she takes the lead against him. He uses the golden apples to trickle across her path, and she gets distracted by them, therein causing her to get beat in the foot race by Hippomenes, and they go on to wed, and they have a son, and the story sort of, goes that direction. So the mixed message, of course, is that she had made a decision about how she wanted to live her life. She took the oath of virginity with Artemis, was not going to wed, was perfectly happy living the life that she was leading in the wilderness, and then essentially was tricked into getting married, and was distracted by these like sort of glimmery shiny baubles. And when we hear the story of Atalanta, it feels a little bit like a mixed message of how a woman can have full total control, and how the male still ends up getting his way in the end, by sort of manipulating or tricking the situation, or tricking her. So that's a story from Greek mythology, that we do see a strong female character. We do see that she eventually gives in to what the man wants in the end. And so in the end, the male really does get to decide her fate, in this case. I did talk about in the story of Atalanta how she takes her oath of virginity with the goddess Artemis. And in your slideshow, you see the sanctuary to Artemis, the Baran sanctuary, where this is an archaeological site where we have found clear indications that women did participate in activities in this sanctuary, particularly wrestling and running. And so we know that women did engage in these competitions at this site, and that this was not widely promoted activities for women to engage in, but it certainly was an indication that there were women, Athenian women, in ancient times, that did compete in a little bit more of aggressive and a little bit more physical, like endurance activities, and where they actually interacted with one another in a physical way, as in wrestling. Because this is not something, when you think about the activities that ancient women were involved in, it's very typical for them to be more leisurely, more individual, again, not quite as strenuous in terms of the activity level. And so we do see that there's indicators that women did engage in these different types of activities, and we see that documented in sort of the artifacts found at the sanctuary to Artemis in Athens. Now there is one particular culture that's part of, or one particular section of the culture of ancient Greeks that we do know looked at women in a very different way, and that was the Spartan culture. Um, Certainly, this was a culture that really revered their women and felt that it was very important for women to be educated, strong, healthy, and capable of sort of was essentially living life, and living life to survive. And the reason they felt that way is because women were the ones that were going to give birth to their children, particularly their male children, and they needed their offspring to be smart, strong, healthy, capable, and so the idea in the Spartan culture was that if our women are educated, smart, healthy, strong, then our offspring are going to be. And obviously, wanting your male offspring to be healthy, strong, and smart was an important aspect of how they looked at the woman's role in that, right? So it was important. It was important that the women in Spartan culture were had the ability to, horseback ride, use a bow and arrow. They could weight lift. They had the ability to run long distances, and they were educated. And so and this is an important sort of counterculture, I guess you could say, to ancient Greek civilizations, because they did look at women in a much different way. They were much more integrated in their society. They weren't just domesticated. It was important that they were able to physically do the same things that the males in their society were able to do, again, so that they were then able to create life, bring in life, and rear life that would be able to do these things as well. So the Spartan culture, definitely a little different in terms of how they looked at women and women's role. And we even see sort of the rise of a prominent Spartan woman in Greek culture that is notable, particularly because what she did was she became sort of the only woman documented that is known to be an ancient an ancient Olympic champion. And that is Siniska, or Kaniska. There's sort of two different ways her name is documented, but Siniska was a chariot racing trainer, and she had a great impact on the world. I mean, on the culture of ancient Greece because of her ability to train and have successful chariot racers. The reason this is so notable is because in the ancient Olympic Games, women were not allowed to participate. They weren't allowed to be spectators. They were not allowed to be anywhere near the grounds of the Olympic competitions, and they certainly were not allowed to physically be there to participate. But Siniska is a documented Olympic champion because in Olympic competition with chariot racing, if you are the trainer, you become the champion, the crown victor when your chariot racer and horses win. So she actually was an Olympic champion, and she won twice in 4-horse chariot racing. And so she became sort of this a Spartan princess symbolic of the social rise of women, right? She kind of became this image of the very capable female alongside of her male counterpart, and is why we also sort of think about how we use the Spartan woman as a symbolism even today of the social rise of women, because what Siniska was able to do was so novel, and it was really the first instance we saw where women were entering into the same arena as men and being comparably successful. So certainly a figure that is worth noting and knowing, and realizing her impact on the ancient Greek culture because of the way that they tended to look at women. And even though she's from the Spartan culture, the fact that she was so successful is very notable. So what did women do? I mean, what did they do because they couldn't compete in the Olympics? The ancient Olympic Games was a little tricky because certainly they sort of felt like they wanted to somehow be involved and have a place in that activity or that event, but they weren't allowed to. So what women did instead was they held their own games in honor of the goddess Hera. They had what was called the Herarian Games. This is a very notable event from ancient Greek society. They were held in the 5th century BCE, and they were also done in 4-year intervals, just like the ancient Olympic Games were. And they were held for essentially 3 categories of women. And literally, they're documented as the youngest, the next oldest, and the oldest group of women. And the women that competed had to be virgin women. And they competed in one event, which was a foot race. They actually used the same site as the ancient Olympic Games there in Olympia, Greece, but they actually ran 1/6 of the length of the same race that the men ran. But they did have this competition where women in their specific age categories could be crowned a victor. When they did win, they actually were treated quite well. They were given a crown, an olive crown, a crown of olives, and they were given a portion of a sacrificial cow that was made to Hera. Sometimes they dedicated statues to the victors with their names inscribed upon them. And so it was actually quite an experience for the women who participated in the Herarian Games. There is an image in your PowerPoint of a typical figure that they believe is from the competitions of the Herarian Games. She's wearing what would have been the traditional garb or the dress of someone participating in the games, which is called a chiton. This is sort of a uniform or a piece of a piece of wardrobe that would go up over the one shoulder, and it would come down and drape down and actually would expose one breast. And this is what they would compete in. And just as a little side note, I'm sure many of you probably know or are aware that the ancient Greek games for the men, they did compete in those in the nude, and so the women didn't fully compete in the nude, but they certainly had their sort of fair share of exposed body parts, skin, when they were wearing their uniform that they wore for the Herarian Games. So anyway, so this figure that you see is attributed to about the 500 BCE era, and is certainly linked to what they believe would be a typical woman who competed in these Herarian Games. So, you know, the Greek women ball games, they did swimming. Certainly there's the stories of Atalanta and Artemis, and even Hera and their role and how they symbolized the strong woman. There's the story of Cynisca that's important to know, but we still have a clear image of women that still puts them in a certain space, right? They still weren't allowed to compete in the ancient Olympic Games. No physically overtaxing activities. They couldn't even spectate where males were competing, and a lot of the stories of what women did compete in or did have a part in are buried or untold. So we're still piecing together, some of the historical content of Greek women, but what we do know are the things that you read in your reading for today, and also what has been shared here through the PowerPoint and the lecture. The last bit of information that is important to extract from Greek history is the story of the Amazons, which originated in Greek mythology. Now you have an article that was linked in your readings that pretty much feels like it clearly indicates the real existence of an Amazonian tribe of women. This was a group of warrior women who believed an all-female society could survive. They were fierce warriors. They are what's believed as like sort of an early symbol of feminism, because they were women who believed they didn't need men to survive. They would cut off one breast. I mean, Amazon comes from the Greek words a and mesos, which is without breast. And so they actually cut off, or they would burn one of their right breasts for the ease of bow and arrow using, not only carrying but also shooting bow and arrow. And they sort of believed in this idea that they could exist without men. I'm sure you're probably thinking, which of course is kind of natural, like, well, how would you have children? Because you sort of need both, right? But the idea is that the women would go out and they would get impregnated, and then when they gave birth, if they gave birth to males, they would release the men, or the boys or the males that were born, and they would keep the women, the girls that were born, the females that were born, and continue to raise them in this all women's society, female society. And so the story of the Amazons is an important one, of course, again, because what we have with the symbolism of the Amazonian woman is a strong female image that makes her own decisions. She cares for herself. She takes care of herself. She takes care of the women around her. She's physically capable of managing all of life's needs, and so very physically strong and capable. And so of course, like, this image of a strong woman is not what we would typically think of as what we typically thought of as women in Greek society being much more obedient and domesticated and staying within the realm of the home and taking care of the home. They're going out beyond the confines of the home, and they're taking care of their family and their unit around them. So the Amazonian culture of women is an important one, and again, it's establishing this idea that women aren't just relegated to one sort of role in society. They can be more than just a domestic figure in a society, and so that is what is important about the story of the Amazons and the existence of the Amazonian culture, the Amazons from ancient Greek society. So one of the things I want you to think about is, for your first inquiry forum, is where else, I want you to think about how you respond to where else you see or you know of images from Greek mythology, Greek stories, Greek writings, ancient Greek writings of women who symbolize strength, and maybe not a much of a domestic type role, but where they symbolize strength and like sort of athletic prowess or ability. I want you to sort of respond to where you have heard or seen or come across these types of images or stories from ancient Greek society. If you don't know any, I don't really want you necessarily to research this. I want you to sort of tell me from your own personal knowledge and perspective what you've learned up to this point in your life, where you've heard stories like this, what you do know and connect with ancient Greek culture that shows or displays women beyond a domestic role. So this is going to be the first sort of prompt that you'll respond to, that I want you to think about and to respond to when you submit your first inquiry form. That's also going to do it for the Greek culture. So the last video will be on the Roman ancient culture, and that'll be the next link here under your Friday lectures. So hang on tight, you got one more to go.